Indeed, is my answer to that song. Right. I said on Friday that we would introduce part THI and part TPC shows, and this will be the last of the THI, although there'll be a couple of pieces later. I want to focus a large portion of the rest of the show on the TPC and what we're doing for those who didn't attend the Zoom. But this expose kind of ties in some ways to the last one. And it's another deep delve into the hidden world of what goes on behind the scenes in war theatres and never reaches the media's doorstep to uncover. Largely because the media, as Operation Mockingbird revealed, are all ran by intelligence agencies at the behest of their Hebrew Anunnaki overlords. And the first portion of this is called ISIS Mayhem, being fueled by drugs and arms supplied by Saudi Arabia and, go figure, the CIA. Now, it's the untold and often hidden history which underpins many of today's proxy wars, conflicts, and the horrific activities of death squads the world over. The strategic dispensing of narcotics in the military theatre and in guerrilla warfare is far more common than many people realise. In many cases, this is the X factor that fuels the mayhem and terrorises vulnerable bystanders on the ground. Now, aside from the traditional problem of substance abuse by the US military and others, drugs have played a pivotal role in many of the recent conflicts and tend to be a feature where the US military and covert intelligence are involved. Oh shit, Sherlock. Now, narcotics trafficking by the military has been well documented in US-backed wars in Vietnam and also Central America, specifically with El Salvador, Nicaragua, Brazil, Colombia, to name but a few. Then you add in NATO's 21st century opium boom in Afghanistan and other NATO narco wars like Yugoslavia, as well as in countless CIA-linked conflict zones featuring death squads in Iraq, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Rwanda, and Angola. This issue is very real. Now, here are some of the examples of the narco-guerrilla warfare phenomena, which are numerous. And a UNICEF report explains children in these war theatres are often deliberately brutalized in order to harden them into more ruthless soldiers. In some conflicts, children have been forced to commit atrocities even against their own families. In Sierra Leone, for example, the Revolutionary United Front forced captured children to take part in the torture and execution of their own relatives, after which they were led to neighbouring villages to repeat the slaughter. Elsewhere, before battle, young soldiers have been given amphetamines, tranquilizers, and other drugs to increase their courage and to dull their sensitivity to pain. Now, the drugs are coupled with sexual exploitation in order to help war planners retain cadres of militant recruits. And these reports have been commonplace coming out of the ISIS crisis in Syria and Iraq, but it's also been a fixture in other US-linked dirty wars. UNICEF adds here, for girls, recruitment may lead to sexual slavery. And the report notes that in Uganda, for instance, young girls abducted by rebel forces were commonly divided up and allocated to soldiers to serve as their wives. And a case study from Honduras prepared for the Mitchell Report illustrates one child's brutal experience of joining armed groups. But Western destabilization merchants know well the effects that depravity brings when it's unleashed on poor populations through militarized violence, drugs, and also sexual abuse. And they know that the scars will run deep, and it guarantees sectarian divisions for generations. Divide and conquer, you see, which allows external powers to maintain a hand in managing the division. Next category, the CIA's deadly cocktail. Throughout history, wherever you find the corrupting combination of the CIA, drugs, or flood a region with weapons and US-backed guerrilla warfare, the result is always the same: the most brutal death squads imaginable. Now, the terrorist wave that took place in Iraq and Syria is no different. Now, the drug of choice for ISIS and other CIA-backed terrorist confabs like al-Nusra Front seem to be amphetamine called Captagon, Captagon, from Pentagon to Captagon. And The Guardian reported those effects explain why fighters from most of the warring parties in the conflict, with the exception of Al-Qaeda-linked groups, which mostly hold to a strict interpretation of Islamic law, are now said to be making extensive use of Captagon, often on night missions or during particularly grueling battles. So now, not only are Al-Qaeda linked to the CIA, which we've covered in past shows, but also al-Nusra. You want to know the reality? Is all of the rebels and terrorists in the Middle East are CIA-created and funded organizations. Like, all of them. And there is evidence of this being on a wider scale when a Saudi Arabian prince was caught trafficking large quantities of Captagon. But because of Turkey's look the other way, because of border guard kickbacks policy, the northern Syria border cities like Kobani and Raqqa serve as major international heroin and Captagon smuggling corridors. And the Kurdish gangs are also a key link in the chain, helping ferry narcotics to lucrative European markets. And recently uncovered was also the possible links between a Dutch organised criminal gangs and Kurdish operations in northern Syria. Now, the Gulf states, full of wealthy, non-working, disaffected youth, are also a growing drug consumer market. And judging by the usual cluelessness or willful ignorance of the mainstream media, do not expect this CIA trade secret to get very much airtime in the West anytime soon. Well, now it has. They are very careful to not overly implicate the US gravy train known as Saudi Arabia. The drug smuggling Saudi prince and the story of Captagon, NATO, ISIS, Libya, Syria, and the Nazis. So here is a question. Who remembers Gaddafi's claim back in 2011 that the jihadists and the NATO-backed rebels fighting to overthrow his government were feeding young Libyan men hallucinogenic drugs to fuel their violent activity? because that's what he said. Bribed, drugged and supporting the devil, he said, was one of Gaddafi's more colourful descriptions of the armed gangs that were terrorising the Libyan people back in 2011. And based on subsequent evidence, it seems a rather pertinent description, and all the media commentators and journalists who made fun of him for saying it are now the ones doing backtracking, because as it turns out, he was correct. But the utter absence of proper investigative journalism or fact-finding in regard to Libya, or anywhere else for that matter, in 2011 was astounding. And the police in Lebanon arrested the Saudi prince, identified by the media as Abdel Mohsen bin Walid bin Abdul Aziz, on allegations he was attempting to smuggle 2 tons of amphetamines on his private jet, which simply reinforced the reality that much of the rabid ultra-violent jihadism we've seen from 2011 onwards has all been linked to illegal drugs. You want to know what the dot connector to all of this is? Well, I'll give you. The dot connector is the CIA, Mossad, Unit 8200, the fake state of Israel, and the proxy Israeli country known as Saudi Arabia. All of them are working together, committing heinous levels of crimes, death and destruction, all at the behest of their Hebrew Anunnaki overlords. That is the reality. Now, during that arrest, 4 others were held in Beirut in what authorities described as a drug bust, connected to the city's Rafik Hariri International Airport. Just a normal drug bust, because we don't want to implicate CIA, you see. That never happens. And in this instance, investigators said they found 40 bags of Captagon amphetamine pills and some cocaine aboard the plane, which had been about to depart for the northern Saudi city of Hayal. And it turns out that that arrest and story links back to Gaddafi, Libya, Syria, and also the rise of ISIL and Daesh, both of which are Israeli-based. Don't believe me? Go and watch the series Mossad. They reveal it all too well. Mainstream media commentators and journalists laughed at Gaddafi in 2011, dismissing his claims as the delusions or lies of an old man trying to cling to power. Yet the evidence has now emerged from the fighting in Syria that many of the Syrian and foreign rebels were fueled by illicit substances. Syrian rebels have been captured and video recorded, clearly in drug-induced frenzies and altered states. Altered states is the key word. But the report says whether this explains some of the depravity of many of the rebels operating in Syria and in ISIS and ISIL in those early stages of the Syrian civil war, particularly in 2012-13, or whether they were just brutal, ultra-violent people anyway, is difficult to say. Well, unbeknown to the writer of this document, those people who took the drugs became host-possessed. Fact. So it's not them carrying out the ultra-violence or atrocities, but the dark spirit now ensconced in those people's vessel. Altered states. Tells you all you need to know. Well, the report goes on where they were shocked at the levels of violence that was going on. And it says, these are people, let's remember, that were, in some cases, among other things, beheading Syrian children and leaving their headless bodies in the street. But it's worth noting that most of the very worst and most brutal crimes of the various jihadists and militants operating in Syria occurred in the early months and the first year or so of the fighting, which was around the time the jihadists and militants were flooding into Syria from the freshly fallen Libya in the now well-attested transfer of both weapons and jihadists that occurred in 2012, and that was overseen by, well, the CIA and the US State Department. Why are we even involved in it? Again, this is something the Americans need to ask. Why are we in these countries? Why are we wasting billions of dollars? Well, nearly over $1 trillion per year on these psychopaths. Now, Captagon, an amphetamine and psychostimulant said to be widely used in the Middle East but mostly unknown elsewhere, was reported to keeping fighters in Syria on their feet during grueling battles and generating money for more weapons. And evidence was starting to emerge that the brutal conflict in Syria, despite having various causes, was also being fueled by both the export and consumption of rapidly increasing quantities of illegal drugs. Footage exists online of various Islamist militants, including Al-Qaeda in Syria or Iraq, where they were noticeably deranged. Their behaviour and their mannerisms are visibly a type of mania. No, it's a type of host. And Abu Sakar, the crazed Syrian rebel who was filmed ripping the heart out of a Syrian soldier and eating it. All very Anunnaki, that. Reminiscent, it has to be said, of the Libyan rebels, quote unquote, who publicly tore out the internal organs of Libyan army soldiers in Misrata early in 2011. Now, all of that is direct evidence of host possession. And this is why I kept warning about drugs. The demons have taken over. And to them, life is another energy harvest and feeding frenzy. Plus the increase in adrenaline allows them to feed more off of the host also. Now, the seizure of amphetamines involving the Saudi prince in Lebanon is just the latest telltale incident. It was also reported was a shipment of around 6 million, there's that figure again, same people as why, Captagon pills were seized, headed for ISIL fighters in Syria, and the accusation was being made from multiple sources that NATO itself began production of the drug in a Bulgarian laboratory in 2011. Well, I never. The Bulgarian connection brings in the CIA again, because the Eastern European Division, which is in Bulgaria, is there. Think Neil Keenan. Yes, he was CIA. Langley 2. Now, that shipment was captured. The shipment that was captured was the very same year of the Libyan and Syrian uprisings, that they are now also producing the drug elsewhere too. Now, for those unfamiliar, the term uprising and revolution If you think that's the people, forget it. Both those terms are now a code word for intelligence agency-based coups. Uprising and revolution is a code word for intelligence agency-based coups. But there is enough evidence to suggest that these drugs have been driving much of the most ultra-violent terrorism since 2011, first in Libya, then Syria and Iraq, and that the drug has been steadily provided by agencies within NATO, Saudi Arabia and possibly other sources from the very start. Indeed. Which, if true, would provide a very different context to some of the more inhuman, shocking behaviour of jihadists and extremists, including mass beheadings, or the setting alight of the Jordanian pilot, or even the sadistic rape. Yes, I said rape. Sadistic rape and murder of Gaddafi himself in October 2011. And these substances and their proliferation would have, in all likelihood, been intended to create manic behaviour and possibly increase susceptibility to following morally questionable orders. And it seems possible that some of the particularly barbaric crimes were being committed by people on these substances. But considering how many of those whose bloodlust was deliberately amplified and utilised for the purposes of the bloody revolutions in Libya and Syria, then subsequently went and joined ISIL-Daesh, either in Syria, Iraq or Libya, it tends to beg the question of whether ISIL owes itself more to drug-induced mania than it does to religious ideas. Correct. But Gaddafi, as with most of the rest of his explanations in 2011, has been proven absolutely correct. And he had tried to explain right from the beginning that the Al-Qaeda leaders and operatives were giving young men free drugs and weapons and telling them to join in. And that this was how the violent events of February 2011 unfolded so quickly and also chaotically. But what Gaddafi presumably didn't know was that the terrorists were probably getting their drugs and other supplies from the various governments, including Saudi Arabia, who were invested in the downfall of Gaddafi and the Libyan state, and then Assad and the Syrian state. The reason why the Saudis are invested is they are the proxy country of Israel, is why. Now, this element of Captagon in the violent jihadism from 2011 onwards, and in turn the rise of ISIL-Daesh, is interesting for another reason too. You will have heard numerous people over the last year or so compare ISIS to the Nazis or the SS in terms of their brutality and their fascist ideology. You want to know why? Because it's one and the same group of people is why, aligned with the various agency-based minions. There was a German author and researcher, Norman Ohler, who published a book recently in which he revealed a new dimension to the rise of the Nazis. Specifically that Hitler's armies had carried out their blitzkrieg invasions of Poland, which is not correct, and France, while high on a version of crystal meth, which kept them wide awake, feeling euphoric and invincible. Or stupid is the correct explanation, if you ask me. And Norman Ohler, O-H-L-E-R, reveals that the key strategic role of the methamphetamine-based drug which was manufactured from 1937 onwards, no doubt by I.G. Farben, by the Nazis under the brand name of Pervitin, Pervitin, and was distributed amongst the Nazi armed forces. Now, according to these findings, based on months of research at military archives in Germany and the United States, the Nazi leadership was well aware of Pervitin's value as stimulant during combat. And having tried it in 1939 during the invasion of Poland, the German army subsequently ordered 35 million tablets of Pervitin for soldiers before advancing on France in the spring of 1940. And that invasion of France shocked the world at the time, the sheer speed of it. In just 4 days, the radicalized and zealous Nazi forces had captured more French territory than German troops had managed to secure in 4 years of the First World War. And Pervitin is now claimed helping the invading Nazis stay awake, keep going, and apparently feel great. And it's true to say that ISIL Daesh lightning capturing of key Iraqi cities also shocked the world in precisely the same way and was considered by most neutral observers as having been unprecedented. And Mr. Ola in his book draws no parallels between the Nazis and ISIS and states his research is purely historical. But Mr. Ola would draw parallels if he understood that ISIS stands for Israeli Special Intelligence Services. Oops. And given that the rise of the so-called Islamic State has certainly been a cynically manufactured event for geopolitical purposes, I tend to wonder if knowledge of how the Nazi soldiers proved so effective early on has been used as a blueprint of sorts for the early successes of the ISIL Daesh terrorists and the Islamo-fascists. Indeed. Same people, same program. And the question being frequently asked of why the various Iraqi forces had been defeated so quickly by the marauding ISIL hordes, perhaps it's a little easier to answer when we consider that those under-equipped and unprepared units found themselves under attack from hordes of insanely zealous jihadists who were high on psychostimulants, feeling utterly invincible, and who were already known to be barbaric. But the drug-induced feelings of invincibility, as with Hitler's troops and their lightning invasions, would also explain how these gangs of maniacs have been able to defeat the non-drug-taking Syrian army and earlier the overwhelmed Libyan army soldiers. Gaddafi's troops had no idea what they were up against, no idea why all these insane youths were rampaging along with Al-Qaeda and other jihadists, and no idea about the drugs or about the involvement of foreign, American, intelligence agencies until it was too late. Which is why Libyan soldiers were initially so quickly overrun and slaughtered in those early incidents in 2011. Now, when they attacked Syria, Assad at least had the benefit of foreknowledge because they watched what was happening in Libya first, which may be one of the reasons the Syrian conflict has gone on for years, whereas the initial Libyan conflict was over in a matter of months. Now, as for the Saudi prince and that drug bust, one has to ask the question, because that was 6 years ago. Isn't drug trafficking punishable by death in Saudi Arabia? This is the same country who executed a teenage boy for attending a pro-democracy event when he was still technically a child. But a major drug dealer would surely have to be dealt with even more harshly. That boy was executed for attending a pro-democracy event. Yet this drug trafficking dealer gets away with it. Somehow there are laws for one group and none for others, as we all know. He probably took his Day of Atonement in Jerusalem. In Expose 8 show, we uncovered the US military engaged in biowarfare connected with the COVID, which also involved how they were creating toxic agents back in the 1950s, which involved missile-based toxic agents and also rain or cloud-based toxic agents, chemtrails. And we mentioned about a secret country club in that show. And if you didn't believe the world's leading artists don't put truth and or piss takes in songs, the next song will reveal differently. Here is an excerpt reminder from that show. Like I said, it was all about toxic agents, rain and cloud-based agents, chemtrails, and the country club. A secret meeting place was constructed for the MJ-12 group in Maryland and is only accessible by air. It contains full living, recreational and other facilities for the MJ-12 group and the Jason Society. It is codenamed the Country Club. The land for the Country Club was donated by the Rockefeller family, and only those with ultra-top secret Magi clearances are allowed to go there. Listen closely to the words in this song.